Hi, my name is Alan Johnson, and we are doing a four-part series that looks at the balance of one's life, balancing four elements of our lives: our social, emotional, our intellectual, our physical, and our spiritual. The idea in mind is that when all four of those elements are working to full capacity, our lives become richer. Today we're going to talk about our social emotional lives. I call it social/emotional because our emotion is wound up in our social lives. They're both interconnected. Today, in our culture, I feel that something dangerous is happening. My fear is that more and more people are coming to the conclusion that their lives, their social lives, are controlled by technology. Texting, for example, has become supremely important, especially among teenagers. Statistics have shown us that girls will text approximately every 6 minutes of their waking hours, and boys every 10 minutes of their waking hours. Recently, I taught a course at Washington State University in interpersonal communications. At the end of the course, I asked one of my students what he would like to do differently, given all the things that we had talked about in the class. And he said, I would like to increase the intimacy that I have with my closest friends. And I said, well, that's great. It's a noble goal. How will you do that? I asked. His response was, I will text them more often. I'm afraid, friends, that texting is not intimacy. In order to get to a place of intimacy, it requires something much more. It requires taking time to really become empathic. You see, the problem is that the brain tends to remember what it practices. And so if the brain is continually practicing flitting from one screen to the next, from one item to the next, that's the way it tends to operate. Empathy takes time. And if we don't practice it, it will dry up. Now, I'd like to talk about what I think should replace intimacy through technology. And that is the forming of community. One of my favorite writers, Scott Peck, talks about this in his book, A Different Drum. He talks about 4 stages of development moving towards community. The first stage is pseudo-community. At that stage, we always want things to work. It's our honeymoon. But it tends to be artificial. It's like that first date when you dressed as best you can, you have your teeth well polished, maybe you speak with a French accent. It is artificial. And if we see something in the other person that we don't care for, we tend to ignore all of the differences because we want the relationship to work so badly. That's the first stage, pseudo-community, the honeymoon stage. The second stage is chaos. It's almost as though a wedding license becomes a license to criticize. And whether it's with a spouse or with a friend or with a team, the same kinds of things occur. where we are protecting ourselves, we are finding that we don't care for the things that we're seeing in that other person. And we are letting them know that one way or another. This is not a happy time. If it continues, the relationship will die. The next step is a huge step, and it requires great initiative. It is called emptiness. And what a person does at this stage is they empty themselves of their ego, recognizing that they no longer have to be right. They've learned that if they have a choice between being right or being kind, they choose being kind. That's what makes the relationship work. If that continues, it moves to the last stage, which is true community. And at true community, all things are possible. Problem solving, for example, is a piece of cake, because we know that we can talk about those kinds of things that may be off the wall because we know we won't be criticized. And when that happens, we increase the potential for solutions that are maybe unusual, but are workable. It's kind of like the age of Aquarius at this stage. It's a time when the community is represented by such things as understanding and tolerance and love. Now, at that stage of community, there are some rules to abide by. And the first is to be real, to be transparent, to talk about what is truly on your mind, and to be willing to be vulnerable. And again, you can be vulnerable if you are truly at that stage of community. The second rule is to listen to understand, not to judge. And to truly understand, to understand wholeheartedly, requires us to take the time and to get a full understanding of what that person is saying, and to be able to repeat it back to that person even more elegantly than he or she can. This is the way we normally listen. Let's imagine that someone says to me, "Hey, Alan, I just got back from Tahiti, and it was wonderful." And my response is, "Oh, really? Hey, I was in Tahiti once, and let me tell you what happened to me. Oh, it was amazing. The scuba diving was incredible, and I loved the fresh fruit." You see their story. I've managed to make my story. That's not listening. That's just talking back. The right response is to say, "Tahiti? My goodness, tell me more about that." Another important rule for abiding by the rules of community is to discard the need to be right. We're no longer in that business. And I can tell you that when you get out of the business of being right and making sure that the other person is not right and loses, your relationship will be richer. Avoid all the attempts to heal or convert the person. Allow the person to discover that for themselves. In the end, that's what works for people. It's not so much what is said to them, although what is said may influence their own thinking to eventually discover for themselves the reality that will work for them. And finally, hang in through the doubt. Because in any relationship, there are going to be times when you wonder, is it worth it? Is it worth putting the effort into this relationship? Almost always the answer is yes, but you have to be willing to struggle through the doubt. So to sum up in talking about our social emotional lives, my suggestion is to get away from the screen. Americans are spending nearly 8 hours a day in front of screen time, and try to have more face time. Try to take more time to allow intimacy to grow, and do that by forming community, which is characterized by wholehearted listening and your own transparency and vulnerability.